Perfect. All right, well, thank you for coming along, everybody. This is the ESIP and USGS Community for Data Integration Interoperability or Information Technology and Interoperability Working Group. This month we have Waldo, is it Jaquith? Is that right? Who is going to present to us about software procurement, broadly speaking, in the federal or the public sector. This topic is a little different than the usual IT&I, and it is prompted by some discussion and comments that I heard from the Data Stewardship Committee, that they were interested in this tension between technical advancement in the kind of public sector in terms of, new APIs, new data formats, new ways of engaging with stakeholders versus cost and sustainability, basically, of the systems that we maintain in the public domain or in the public sector. And a colleague of mine who now actually works at search.gov, Jim Kraft, made some recommendations of a few people to reach out to get some perspective on the problem, and Waldo came up as one of the top. So Waldo, I'll let you introduce yourself and your background that Jim would have referenced you there, but I know it comes from your history with AT&F. So with that, this is a rant and rave. I'm excited to see where you take the format, and I'll turn the floor over to you and let you take us away.
All right. Hello. Yes, I'm Waldo Jaquith. I was with the Biden administration up until November when I decided to take some time off. So now I spend part of my time with the U.S. Digital Response, a nonprofit organization, and I'm going through the approval process to spend part-time in a federal position with a federal agency as well, working on exactly what I'll be talking to you all about here today. My background is as a software developer. I joined AT&F, the federal government's technology shop, in 2016 and spent 4 years there. And like I suspect a bunch of y'all, I realized pretty quickly that procurement is how government does a lot of stuff. Like a dispiritingly large amount of technology only happens through procurement. And at encouragement of colleagues, I realized that I needed to go down the procurement rabbit hole as a software developer, because that's where the rubber meets the road. That most government technology happens in that way, and to avoid that would be to avoid how things actually get done. So I went deep into procurement and budgeting and oversight at a federal, state, and local level, and how and why projects fail as a matter of course in government for big technology projects. When you're spending tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. Custom software makes government go round. Like every agency depends on one or more bajillion-dollar custom software systems, without which agencies would crumble to dust. Like I don't know what they would do if those things collapsed. I've started thinking of those as load-bearing systems. Mission critical is true for a bunch of IT, but these load-bearing custom software systems, by which I mean, like there's no competition, there's no COTS available. Somebody or team of somebody's over the course of many years has probably built some software tool that drives these systems. Unfortunately, we're extraordinarily bad at procuring this sort of software. Like we can buy Microsoft Office licenses and we've more or less figured out how to buy cloud services, but custom software, we're actually really awful at that. So what we're going to talk about here is all of the ways in which software procurement has failed us. And then we'll talk about an alternate model, and then we'll have time for discussions and questions. So I'm going to start with a couple of stories because I like stories. We're going to start with a story some of you know, and some of you don't, because it turns out it's been a decade and people have forgotten or were too young to pay attention at the time. So I have to tell this anew. Healthcare.gov. So the viability of the Affordable Care Act depended on a website. Certainly the political viability of the website, of the Affordable Care Act, but substantial portions of the actual Affordable Care Act were to be executed via this website. So naturally, it was very, very important that it work, particularly for what could have been seen at the time, and really in retrospect is certainly seen as a President Obama's signature achievement. Obamacare was the name that was attached to this pejoratively, but it turned to a positive mostly. The contract for this was given to CGI Federal. They're a Canadian company, incidentally, but that's not really important to the narrative. CGI's bid was for $93 million. Oh yeah, okay. And then you know where I'm going with this. Leslie saying where she knows what's going on opening day, or what tried to go to the website on opening day. CGI's accepted bid was for $93 million to build this website, which it's a lot of money. On the other hand, it's a very normal amount of money to spend on a big website like this in government. It's not an appropriate amount of money. It's not a pseudo amount of money. If you can step out of like your Fed tech mindset for a minute, $93 million is a vast amount of money. Like in the private sector, outside of, government-like industries like banking and insurance and so on, nobody's spending $93 million in software. Like that's not a thing, but it's very much a thing in government. So their bid was for $93 million. It cost $1.7 billion by the launch date. And they subcontracted to a bunch of other companies. So CGI Federal was the prime, but there were lots and lots of subs. So the site launched on October 1st, 2013. A literal few minutes, or a literal few people managed to go through the website and actually get coverage. I forget, it's low single digits. The site was completely overwhelmed by traffic in ways that were entirely forecastable. Probably were forecast, but not forecast by any decision makers, or that information was provided to decision makers. So the Catherine Sebelius, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, was completely blindsided because she'd been told all along that everything was going great. She got those reports every week, every month, whatever, green light, green light, green light, everything's going fine, we're in good shape. Now the developers working on the site, because there was a great report by I think it was the IG. I hope I credit it correctly. I don't think it was GAO. I think it was by the IG afterwards into how this failed. Really good reading. Really like I would buy like a paperback copy, put on my shelf of this IG report. It was really helpful. One of the things revealed by subsequent investigations, the developers working on the site, they knew it was going to fail. They hated working on this. They were forced to work in ways that didn't make sense, that didn't enjoy, that weren't going to yield good software. But nobody wanted to admit it. There's a concept that management types use of strategic misrepresentation, basically lying in ways that are probably sensible. And there's a lot of strategic misrepresentation here, in which the developers working on this, and I'm going to make this up at all levels, the developers working on this might have said, this is horrible, this is a nightmare, this will never, ever work, to their managers. And their managers tell their managers, it's really bad. This is really bad. We do not think this is going to work. We think it might fail. And they tell their bosses, it's not going great. Everybody's going to do their best, but there's a significant risk of failure. And they tell their boss, we're going to pull this thing off. Don't worry. But at the moment, it's a little rough. Every step of the way, a little more optimistic. And so by the time it gets to the Secretary of Health and Human Services, she's told, it's going great. We're going to be fine. At every level of the way, people are relaying something that's a little more rosy, a little more optimistic, until everything sounds pretty good. It's not lying necessarily on the part of any one individual. They're just providing the best view that they can. It's a sort of an optimism bias as well. The point here is that Health and Human Services had no actual oversight of the work. They were just overseeing the contract. They weren't seeing a website. They weren't seeing software being developed. That wasn't part of the oversight process. It was just saying, are you accomplishing the requirements? Do you have a traceability matrix where we can see how those are being met? But looking at the software, no, that's nobody's job. So total debacle, great story. A bunch of my friends and colleagues were part of fixing the website, getting it working again by bringing modern software practices to bear within a couple of months. Site was great, worked really well. It's ultimately a big success story. That's a great story on its own. I'm telling the very narrow story of healthcare.gov of how it initially failed. It failed in a way that is very normal, really normal for big government software projects that fail like this. Story number 2 of 2, Rhode Island UHIP. So Rhode Island, they wanted, I think this project started maybe 2013 or thereabouts. They wanted a single system for public health or software infrastructure. So Medicaid and food stamps and childcare assistance and all of these things that they called UHIP. Let's bring it all together as like an integrated eligibility system. This was a $364 million project. The contract went to Deloitte. Governor Raimondo, the governor of Rhode Island at the time, this was important to her. This is a big deal. A lot of people's ability to receive benefits depended on this going well. And a couple weeks before launch, she got some bigwig at Deloitte to personally assure her that everything would be fine. Because everything she said was, everything's every step of the way, everything's going great. Don't worry, this is going to be fine. But she's nervous because she's never seen the software. So she approved, based on that assurance of Deloitte, she approved even laying off the people whose job it was to answer the phones at the old phone-based system because they're moving to a new online thing. Effective the date of the switchover, September 2016. So what they were doing was what's known as a big bang deployment. Many of y'all are probably familiar with it. It's the idea that if you're switching to a new system, don't do it gradually. No reason to do that. Just shut the old one down on a Friday and have the new one up and running by Monday. No big deal. Okay, that's a very normal way to do this, and it's a very normal way to fail. Like, I don't know why you would do that when there's a perfectly viable alternative of gradually moving over to a new system, so that instead of failing with everything at once, if you fail it just with a little bit at a time, that seems safer. But nope, not what they did here. Total debacle. Nothing worked. Medicaid recipients, like many of them, had their benefits wrongly terminated. Folks couldn't get SNAP benefits, no food. And the laid off call center workers couldn't even get the benefits that they needed because they weren't there to answer the phones because they'd been laid off. So this did real serious damage to thousands of people's lives in Rhode Island. This is not just about software not working. This is about a bunch of agencies unable to accomplish their mission because they outsourced their ability to accomplish their mission to Deloitte. And Deloitte, who is not as invested in accomplishing the missions of these agencies as the agencies themselves were. But the good news is Deloitte was severely punished. They were forced to apologize while speaking to a Rhode Island committee meeting of the legislature. And then, just to really drive the point home, in 2021, they were given a $99 million contract to continue working on the system because the punishment for blowing a $300 million system is getting another $100 million, and the contracts will continue until the software works. That contract can be extended through 2030. So that's how we do this. That's how we do these big systems. There are so many stories like this. Every state has a little parade of these humiliations. Every federal agency gets burned every few years. These are routinely on the scale of hundreds of millions of dollars. Often they have nothing to show for their money. You don't hear these sorts of stories about $1 million, $2 million, $3 million projects because they're much less likely to fail. And if they do, it wasn't a huge amount of money comparatively. This lost. Nobody gets fired. On the other hand, you can blow $100 million on a contract and not get fired for that either because we've so normalized that. My first half of my thesis here is that software procurement has failed us completely. I mean that on like a governmental level, a societal level, like it's bad. And when I say software procurement, I don't mean COTS. I mean these load-bearing systems. I mean these big custom software systems on which the agency depends to be able to achieve their mission. We had this norm of outsourcing technology that really got underway in the 90s in government. And the idea was, hey, agencies aren't experts in technology. So if we need some sort of a custom technology thing, we should just pay the private sector for that. That seems to make more sense. And that was one thing when it was, I don't know, LANs or high-speed printers hooked up to terminals at desktops or, whatever it may be. But there's been a big change since the 1990s, and that is that increasingly the mission of many agencies is intermediated by technology, either in a direct way, where you actually have to go to an unemployment insurance website to file an application for benefits, or you have to go to a treasury website or a State Department website, for all these sort of like normal interactions with government, or in a secondary way in which you might be calling into a call center and talking to a person, but that person is using a custom piece of custom software that was developed to drive that agency. So whether whether it's a member of the public who's directly interfacing with this system, or a government employee or a contractor, these are all these systems that we've, as a matter of course, we have normalized as power in government, which is good. but via a means of outsourcing, which often fails, which is bad. We're still using the procurement model that imagines that it's okay if these don't work out, while loading up those contracts with more and more and more and going bigger and bigger, understanding that they're very, very likely to fail. Let's look at some numbers. Of all government software development contracts over $6 million, only 13% are successful. That's within cost, schedule, and performance. That's not to say that all the rest are, the remaining 87% are failures. A little under half fail outright. You have nothing to show for your money. And then the balance, you get something, but it is more than 20% over budget. It is more than 20% over schedule in terms of total days elapsed. Or it falls more than 20% behind the performance that was supposed to be delivered. The software is supposed to get, the number of features, depending on how you count that kind of thing. Once you get up to higher dollar values, $10, $20 million, you're sunk. Your odds of success go down to like 2%. It's extremely grim. Great DoD study. DoD does great studies on software development. So about half of systems developed across $37 billion worth of DoD spending didn't actually meet the needs of the end users, the actual audience of the software. They met the specifications of the contract, but the specifications of the contract were unrelated to the needs of the people who used the system. So even the software that actually gets delivered, that about half of that doesn't actually do anything that anybody needs it to do. Great private sector study of 400 projects of looking on a feature basis found that only about 10% of the code developed in what's known as waterfall software development, the idea that requirements rain down from on high and programs' job is just to execute what the requirements say, regardless of whether or not it seems like a good idea or whether or not there's any conversation with users to prove that it's a good idea. Software developed like that, only 10% of that code was ever even deployed, and only 2% of those features were ever used. So, you can't really stack this up, but it's not unreasonable to say, a minority of software is ever actually successfully delivered under this. About half of that only actually does anything users need, and only about 10% of that is ever deployed. And, in turn, 1/5 of that is ever used. And this is really bad. Even if you can't line those up perfectly, you get the idea. It's grim. Procurement action lead time, the amount of time that it takes for this whole procurement process. It takes 260 days just to get the work started, just to go from like, hey, we want to issue an RFP until a contract is awarded. We spend all that money just to fail and spend all that time on a process that fails. This isn't good for anyone. Agencies yell at Deloitte, et cetera. They're an easy stand-in here, but there's a bunch of vendors in this space when these things fail. But the vendors, they don't care. You can yell at me all you want if you give me $300 million. That's a good trade. Yelling at the vendor is not a useful strategy. If you can't terminate the contract, then you're forced to accept whatever the vendor feeds you. Like, that's it. That's it. You're stuck. So project managers and contracting officers and even agency principals, they think the solution to these problems is writing more and more detailed requirements, not realizing that requirements complexity is fractal. It goes on forever. There's no level of detail that will result in stuff being done perfectly. I have a couple of kids, and like all kids, that they can be difficult. And my eldest, when he was little, I could say like, "We got to go. Put on your shoes," and he would like put them on his hands. Okay, please put your shoes on your feet, and he like put them on the wrong feet. Okay, please put shoes on the correct feet. We've got to go. And he'd find some other way to like do the thing I was saying without doing what I needed him to do. That's requirements writing. There's no level of specificity that is sufficient. Eventually, you just put the kid's shoes on. That's the actual solution to this problem. You just do it yourself. This approach of writing more and more and more requirements, it's never ending. I've seen particularly like state healthcare systems. I've seen solicitations, RFPs and the like, with over 1,000 pages of requirements. They're no more likely to succeed. My guess is, I've never seen data on this, but like anecdotally, they're more likely to fail. And even if we pretend the requirements are written perfectly, you have actually correctly described the work that you want the vendor to do. as we've already seen with the DoD numbers, that doesn't necessarily mean that's what anybody wants. And so you wind up with this scenario in which you get developers developing the code that's required by the contract. But they're not idiots. What they're developing, they know this is not what users want. This doesn't work. This doesn't even make sense. But we have to do what's in the contract. Otherwise, we need a change order. Nobody wants change orders. So the comparison that comes to mind for me is there's this fungus that infects, I'm going somewhere with this, hear me out, that infects brains of ants. And the fungus doesn't want, a fungus doesn't want anything, but the fungus doesn't want to be in the ant. The fungus wants to infect sheep. So it makes this ant want to climb to the top of whatever plant it can find, usually blades of grass, so that it will be eaten by sheep and it can get into the sheep. That's the goal of this thing. But you can just imagine the ant thinking like, I don't want to go up higher, but I'm going higher. Why am I doing this? That's the developers who are stuck writing dumb code, adding features that nobody wants or that are going to make people's lives worse. That's what we're doing when we write these detailed requirements instead of actually trying to figure out what it is that users need. Coincidentally, I saw this quote a couple days ago from Governor Raimondo, formerly Governor Raimondo, now she's a Biden administration official, speaking about this UHIP project. It just speaks volumes about how these things go wrong. She says, Deloitte presented much too rosy of a picture to us. I sat in meetings with Deloitte and questioned them, and they gave us dashboards that showed us everything was green and ready to go. And the fact of the matter was that it wasn't. So she wasn't given the work to look at. She was given, one of these, most recently I was in the front office leadership position of the U.S. General Services Administration. There are so many projects that you're supposed to oversee. Some are really important and actually should, the administrator's office should spend a bunch of time on. And others, you just need to make sure that somebody's keeping an eye on it. But in every case, what you're seeing as a matter of course is occasional reports that say everything's going great. That doesn't reflect what may actually be happening, but it's tough to know when it does and when it doesn't. So there's a sticker on the back of my laptop that I use to summarize this. It says demos, not memos. When you get a memo about how software is going, you know nothing. You may know worse than nothing. You may know a thing that's wrong, which is even more harmful than not knowing. What you want is a demonstration of the software. That's a lot more useful because otherwise it is the dashboard that you're getting is a dashboard, the dashboard the governor is seeing is the dashboard in the same sense that this is a car's dashboard. Like you create those to make leadership happy, but it doesn't actually give an accurate perspective of what's actually going on. It's I wouldn't say an elaborate illusion. It's a really crude illusion that you're seeing something useful and the project is going great. So you're told it's green, 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 green until one day, oh, it failed. Who can say why? It just failed. It went from green to red with no intermediate step. Happens all the time. Pretty normal thing for these big software procurement projects. Let's move on to the but no more part. I'm gonna bomb through this in part because I think a bunch of y'all will be familiar with some, if not all, of these concepts. So I don't want to waste your time. Let's consider this remedial. But this is how we can fix this. What I'm going to describe here is a model that 18F has honed over the years, and I was a participant in. This works great at all levels of government. I have used this approach dozens of times over the past 7 years, I guess. There are 6 disciplines that together allow projects to succeed at a much, much higher rate. User-centered design, agile software development, product ownership, DevOps, building out of loosely coupled parts, and modular contracting. I'm going to review these real quick to make sure that we're all on the same page. But the important thing to understand is that when all of these things are brought together, that they work together in a way that has a benefit, which the sum is much greater than its parts. And each of these things makes possible each of the other things, in which you're no longer then looking at a fake dashboard. You're no longer hoping that the vendor will deliver, but agencies can actually be in charge and oversee effectively the work that's being done on these projects and actually achieve their mission, which seems important. So I'm going to go through each of these real quick. User-centered design, we'll start with that one. The number one is 6. The proposition of user-centered design is that it's absurd to spend months gathering hundreds of pages of requirements for software because you don't know what people need until you talk to them and show them prototypes to figure it out. So you talk to people, you find out what they need, you go away, you design some stuff, you go back, you show them the designs, and you find out if they work well. And then you go away and you do some more design and you go back and you just keep repeating this until their needs are met. And they say, yes, this is what I needed. I'm happy now. We're all done. Great. That's it. That's user-centered design. It's not real hard, but it is the opposite of some, what is the title people use for this? Like business case manager or something? Business analyst. That's it. The business analyst whose job it is to like invent user stories out of whole cloth. Don't do that. Just talk to users, find out what they need. Second, agile software development. I'm sure you all have seen all sorts of horrible implementations of Agile. I hope some of you all have been able to experience really great implementations of Agile. Quick refresher for any of y'all who haven't used it for a while. The premise of Agile is that you build a thing real simple, usually in a couple of weeks, and you see if it's any good. And then you go back to the users and say, is this what you needed? And then if they say no, then you go back and you work on it some more. And if they say yes, then you find another group of users who need something else, and then you do that with them for a while. And you repeat like this. This is done with small software development teams, usually 4 to 9 people. And each one of these software sprints usually lasts 2 weeks. And if you need more throughput than 4 to 9 people, add more teams. And so they work in parallel, each working with probably with slightly different user groups or on slightly different needs. With Agile, every 2 weeks, what's being delivered is finished software. Might be in a crude state at first, but it should be usable within 2 weeks. So one way to describe software, as we've seen with requirements, is listing the features that are supported. Same with any project as well. One way you could do it is you could define those features based on what a user's needs are, a discrete need that needs to be addressed by a given feature. So under Agile, you're trying to select features that can be built independently and completely in any order. We can see where we go from 1, 3, 5, 2. It shouldn't matter too much if you're picking them right. So as each feature is completed, the entire system works and supports all previous features. You can order those features by user value. Ideally, you do the most important thing first, or any other choice. Working software is available from the very beginning of the project, in contrast to the busted way of procuring this stuff. So you can find out pretty soon, is this vendor any good? Is this work any good? Is it going to work for us? And you might say after, say, 6 months, if this software is not ready to go, in some stage, if we can't put it in production and deliver some value to the users, we're done. We got to terminate this contract, because otherwise you're just going to keep spending money until finally you've spent all $350 million and have nothing to show for it. So here's our alternative. Crucial here is that you're constantly building a usable product that's used by its target audience as much of the time as possible as you iterate towards something that's fully featured. So for this famed illustration, you're addressing a need here, transportation, and not a feature like an internal combustion engine. And so you're trying to figure out how to best meet their needs. They're not helped by a couple of wheels attached by a chassis, but their life has been improved by a skateboard or a bicycle. Transportation keeps getting better. One of the benefits of this model under Agile is that you can find out when the users are happy and stop there. Maybe all this person wanted was a bicycle. You're done. Great. You get to finish after 3 of these iterations. All done. They're happy. You spent a lot less money. It was a lot less work. A frequent problem, I did this for many years as a software developer, is continuing to polish a thing. It's actually done. It's been done for a while. The users are happy. Stop. Go away. You can give them something much simpler and they would have been happy. So under this Agile approach, work is all done when the users are happy, whether for the feature or for the whole project. Last thing I want to talk about here about what Agile brings about is the different control model of how government controls work under these 2 approaches. So under the busted model, the waterfall control model, government is responsible. Oh God, thank you for mentioning The Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman. It's 1 book back on my shelf there. Love it. I recommend it highly. Under the legacy model, the only thing that government is responsible for, and this is by design, is identifying tasks, those requirements in the contract. That's it. And this is by design, because when contracts have failed, government says, well, let's just put more on the vendor next time. And we're 30 years into putting more and more and more on the vendor, figuring, well, then we can blame them when it doesn't work. You can blame them. They still got $300 million and you still don't get to accomplish your mission. So blame is overrated here. But historically, and under really substantially the status quo, government identifies tasks. Nobody ever talks to users to find out if we're doing anything that they want. The vendor is responsible for writing the code, testing the code, and I mean that in an automated testing sense, performing QA, deploying the code into production, and then performing system integration. Under an Agile model, and what that means for the change of procurement, as we're going to talk about here, it's very different. Here, the vendor and government work together on the user research to identify the task to be performed. And identifying tasks and user research becomes substantially one and the same. The only thing the vendor is solely on the hook for is writing code. Now, the vendor might write tests, but it's on government to read the tests and make sure they're any good. The unit tests, the end-to-end tests, the smoke tests, whatever you're doing, and then to actually make sure that all of those tests pass. QA, making sure that in a functional sense, it does what it's supposed to. That's on the government to make sure that's done. Actually deploying the code, sure, the vendor should write the CI/CD automation, but it's on government to actually exercise that pipeline and make sure that it works successfully. It's agency's responsibility. And then system integration, don't put that on the original vendor. Maybe you hire another vendor to do that, but government needs to be the one who's responsible for like knitting all of these things together. So all of this is what's facilitated by or even implied by using Agile in government. So like we see under this model that government partners with a vendor on a lot, but government is ultimately responsible for everything because we are. So like let's not pretend otherwise. Product ownership. This is another real short one here. Product ownership. Somebody needs to be in charge of bringing together what users want, what stakeholders want, what's possible or desirable with technology, and what the business needs are. This is the product owner. This is one person who works for government, whose job it is to make sure that all of these things are executed well. This is the person who's responsible for the thing that is being built and executing it successfully. So an Agile team in government looks a little different than it sometimes does in the private sector. That you have one person on that Scrum team, on that Agile development team, who's a product owner with the agency. So the product team is outsourced except for that product owner. And the reason that needs to be an agency employee is because this person will know so much about this software. And if they don't at the beginning, they sure will by the end of the project, because they're that team's one conduit to the agency. They're who, when they want to know exactly how to build a feature, exactly what's possible or allowed or how to do something, that product owner is the person who says, yes, I have the power to make up my mind about that on behalf of the agency, and here's what we're going to do. If you were to outsource that, you can't cut the vendor loose because you lose all of your knowledge that is embodied in the product owner. This is about knowledge and control over the contracting process. DevOps. Again, I appreciate you all probably know this stuff, so I'm keeping it quick. DevOps is just taking the development of software and then the operations of the server and hosting infrastructure, or wherever it's living, adding in some security and some automation, and you let people do the things that they're good at and computers do the things that they're good at. I normally spend a lot longer explaining this. Y'all aren't going to need it. I'm going to move on to the architectural concept of building out of loosely coupled parts. This is just the idea that instead of replacing the busted old monolith system that everybody hates with a new monolith system that everybody's going to hate, instead, you should figure out how whatever the new thing is that you're building can be comprised out of a series of smaller components. For those of you all familiar with it, a great comparison here is something like AWS, your vendor of your choice, where if you're building out of these components, you can use S3 for storage to back your EC2 instances, and RDS is going to be your database, or whatever you're doing. That's this modular concept. Legos are a perfect example of this. Bump on the top, hole in the bottom, snap them together. You can build big, complicated things out of this incredibly simple interface for these loosely coupled parts. Light bulbs. This is the Edison screw, developed by Thomas Edison's team in 1909. It's still overwhelmingly how we put light bulbs and light fixtures. You don't have to talk to your power company to find out what light bulbs are supported. It's a loosely coupled standard. You know the thing's going to screw in and that it's going to work. The important bit is this concept of interchangeable parts, which was key to the Industrial Revolution. That's finally come to software. Like that's a standard thing now in software. I mean, y'all, okay. This is a metaphor I can use with y'all. I just think of the underpinnings of Unix. I can pipe all sorts of stuff together. That is, to me, like the ideal demonstration embodiment out of building out of loosely coupled parts. When you fire off something, you got sed going into cat, going into sort, going into word count, piping into a SQLite. Like that's what you can do with loosely coupled parts. The same architecture can exist on a larger scale with software that you're building. it is so much easier to be able to work at that sort of a scale. Finally, modular contracting. This is the bit that I assume most of y'all are the least familiar with, but it'll just take a minute to talk about here. Modular contracting is the idea that this traditional contracting method is bad, where you go away for years and gather a bunch of requirements, and then you put together an RFP, and then a big construction process takes place over the course of many years, only at the end of which do you actually have a thing that anybody can see or use or do anything with. This is what happens with hundreds of pages of requirements. This is bad. This is an illustration of why things don't go well here. The modular contracting approach assumes that things change. So here you get constant feedback on a product being developed with a series of smaller contracts. You might have more than one simultaneously. You might have a couple of vendors, 3, 4, 5 vendors working at the same time, or it might be in series. But each one of these little modules is built in months. Delivery is the strategy here. You have these shorter procurement times. This forces vendors and buyers to focus on building discrete things. And these RFPs are like 20 pages each with only a few requirements, because requirements prevent discovery via user research. So it's much faster for contracting shops to be able to issue these contracts. And overseeing the contracts is not hard if you have a product owner who's in charge of inspecting this stuff and a technical lead within the agency whose job is to actually review the code that's written to make sure that it meets whatever standards that you've laid out in your RFP. So again, these are the 6 changes that combined make it possible to have an acquisition strategy that's not rooted in helplessness. With this approach, agencies don't have to outsource their mission along with their technology. So to support this, you need that technical lead to review the work. You need the product owner, but it's not real hard. It's work. It's different, but given that you're much less likely to blow $300 million, I don't know, it seems maybe good hiring a few people to do that. So in conclusion, I'm going to bring this all together here. Under this approach, large projects can have multiple development teams spread across multiple contracts with multiple vendors. And the vendors don't have to coordinate in any laborious way because they're all working on their own module, loosely coupled parts, which has documented inputs and outputs, and the other vendor teams refer to that documentation to interface with those modules. At AWS, the teams overwhelmingly at AWS do not coordinate because there's too many AWS products. They couldn't possibly coordinate. Instead, they just publish their API specs and everybody else works within those. If your vendor isn't performing under this, you can end that contract without losing all your velocity because there are other vendors who can keep working at the same time. Or you don't lose your store of knowledge about the actual work being done because the project knowledge works within the product owner. So it's way less threatening to lose that vendor. You can use a time and materials contract where you just pay them for their time until you don't want their time anymore, and then you say goodbye, instead of firm fixed price. There's a fear of time materials contracts among contracting officers, which is a good and sensible one. They say, we don't know what the vendors are doing. They could rack up big bills. We can't control costs. That's true. But if you're using Agile and you have a product owner and you're getting delivery every 2 weeks, oh, those fears should be out the window because you know exactly what's going on. This will be the most tightly overseen contract ever executed by these contracting officers. So these RFPs and contracts are simple. They're basically Mad Libs. You're just changing some demonstration user stories to give vendors an idea of what's going to be done. You're changing the mission and maybe a few requirements, but they're about 20 pages long. So this is a big time saver for contracting staff. Under this approach, value is delivered after 2 weeks and every 2 weeks after that. Agencies always know what they're getting for their money, and users can start using that software as soon as it's in good enough shape to deliver meaningful value. And then finally, the work is good because it's all been centered on user needs, prioritized by how valuable those needs are. And because that government technical lead is examining the work at the end of every 2-week sprint to ensure that it's up to snuff. This is not an idea I dreamed up. This is not like a theory. This is a discipline. It's being used by federal agencies and by state agencies across the country and has been since about 2016. Works great, much higher success rate. Don't have a lot of change orders. Everybody's much happier under this approach. I rest my case. Let's move on to questions and answers and strident objections.
Awesome. I think there's a number of people on the phone, myself included, that are thinking about, anyway, this is a lot to think about. And there's a lot of ongoing things that are similar to what you're talking about.
There's a very normal question that people like to ask at this point, which is really an objection phrased as a question, which is this can't possibly work. I was there. I've been there. That for any of y'all who've tried to deal with this or been on the wrong end of this, it can seem unsolvable. It can seem like, no, because you didn't consider this other thing over here, or no, what about this scenario? Ask me about those, raise those objections. I'm happy to talk about that because those holes did exist in this theory of change. Those were, whatever you're going to raise was a problem at some point, and it's very likely that whatever concern you're going to raise, there is a good solution to, and I'd be happy to talk about it.
Well, it's not so much a concern, and I see Ben Webb has his hand up, but I'm going to throw one thing maybe for you to flesh out a little bit. So when you're talking about modular contracting, give an example or two. I have one analogy for that personally with an IDIQ contract and limited scope task orders against it. That's been very successful. And I'm wondering what you've seen as other ways of structuring modular contracts at that kind of actual procurement level.
Yep. Yeah, I'll give two levels of examples there. So the first is that because contracts are such a pain to award in government, the idea is you want to do them rarely. And so whenever somebody is going to issue an RFP for something, you want to attach as much as you possibly can to that at that point. So contracts aren't really for software development. They're probably for software development and maintenance and operations and tech support and help desk and hosting and security reviews. And, like anything you can possibly apply in there goes in one contract. The problem is there are a lot of very good software vendors who have no interest in doing any of those parts except for the software development part. So the high-level modular contracting, which doesn't even speak to the software architecture, is stop doing that. Have one contract that's for software development, and then have another one that's for support or whatever other things that you want to lump in there. But connecting software development to these other things is demanding completely unrelated skills from software developers and really drives up what ultimately is the cost of this work, because you wind up with vendors who they can't do all those things. They just sub it out, and they sub it out because they want to get a cut, and because otherwise they're not going to get the contract. So you're driving the costs up of this work while getting inevitably a less capable software developer working on that project. The second level, though, to I think more directly answer your question, though, is around what modular contracting actually looks for breaking up a contract for a software development project. So for that, you want to identify what the fault lines are in the software where you could actually break it up. So imagine a state unemployment insurance system. So you might say, okay, so one need that we have is we need an application system, what the website looks like for the entire interface for somebody who's applying for benefits, checking on the status of those benefits and seeing at any time what the state of them is after it's approved. We think that's a module. So that's, being the right way to do this thing with Agile software development, it should be the whole slice. It's not just a front end. It's the application layer, it's the database or whatever the data store is on the back end, everything goes into that. Well, at the same time as that's happening, you might say, okay, second thing that we need is we need an identity verification system. How do we know these people are who they say they are? So we need another contract, but not with a custom software developer, really. We need to find a vendor that's in this business. And you might go with login.gov, which would be my suggestion there. But we want a second contract for that, because the ability to verify people's identities is really unrelated to being able to develop software. So we don't want that. Okay, then also we need the ability to send lots of emails, like a core means of communications is emails. We need some sort of a system for actually creating those templates, translating them across multiple languages, being able to interface with that system to fill in, again, Mad Lib style, those letters that go out, and then actually have, whatever service that we're going to use to actually, because we're not going to run our own SMTP server for that, that we're going to procure for that. So let's get another contract for that, and so on. And so none of those people none of those teams need to directly work with each other. Those are things that can happen at the same time. If you break those up badly, though, if you pick the wrong fault lines, you're going to have a bad time. And so it's my suggestion to people using this modular approach to, at the beginning, just like with user stories for a project, you're going to pick the first thing you think you need to start with. Ideally, something kind of small. Begin with that, see how it goes. and then say, oh, that thing we thought we were going to do next, that's actually wrong. We're going to pick this other thing to do next. And here's what we think we're going to do third. And you may interleave those. So you might have a 1-year contract, and 6 months in, you award another 1-year contract to somebody else. And 3 months in, you award 2 6-month contracts to 2 other vendors. You might go back to a prior vendor who got a contract, and they might bid on another one. You don't necessarily have one vendor per contract. You could have one vendor getting multiple contracts. Did I answer your question?
You did. That's very helpful. I think, yeah, we've got people probably operating at a little lower level of contracting in this. At least that's me.
Sure.
But what you said resonates, and it makes perfect sense.
I want to endorse an answer here that was in the chat. Where Leslie had asked, any tips for geomorphologists or other non-IT people into adequate product owners, asking for a friend. Lee's answer was, I took a product owner training course, which is super helpful. Yes, being a successful product owner does not require technical knowledge. You'll pick it up. It will be important to have, but it is so much better to take somebody who's a subject matter expert and whatever the thing is that agency is doing, ideally with a long history at that agency, or in a position of modest power, or both, and make them a product owner through something like product owner training and just through brute experience. That is so much more useful than hiring somebody from outside, which means they have no power within the agency to make decisions on behalf of anybody, or somebody like me who's a technologist but knows nothing about the USGS or geomorphology. Like, don't do that. So please be turned into product owners. That would be really, really great.
Yeah. So Ben Webb has his hand up. Ben, you want to go ahead?
Yeah. So I have the privilege of being an open source software developer. So I would say I'm far from calling myself a naysayer, but a quote from Producing Open Source Software by Carl Fogel really stands out to me, which is
hey, Carl's a friend.
Yeah, one of the great surprises for me in preparing the second edition of this book was realizing that on a whole experience indicates that governments are less suited for participating in free software projects than for-profit corporations are, with nonprofits somewhere between the two. There are many reasons for this, and the problems are certainly surmountable, but it's worth noting that when an existing organization, particularly a hierarchical one, and particularly a hierarchical, risk-averse, and publicly sensitive one, starts or joins an open source project, the organization will have to make some adjustments. And I guess the question or thought I would pose to you is, how do you make the sale? And I honestly think the statistics you posed at the start of this were a pretty good start to one of the decision makers, but how do you convince them that it is worth taking on the risk and owning the product instead of being able to point at Deloitte for failing?
Yeah, a few different ways. The most important one is whenever there's a process that I like going through. It's a workshop process in which I did this with colleagues at IT&F. We would, over the course of 3 days, provide training on the 6 things that I talked to you all about here, like a visioning exercise to help them figure out what they're trying to do here. And then the third day would actually be putting together an RFP. And at some point, some important muckety-muck would join, having missed day 1 and sometimes day 2, and object to something everybody else in the room had already figured out. And their objection usually boiled down to, I don't like this new thing. I like the status quo. And my question always was, how's that working out for you? Because it's not. It's going terribly for them. That's why I'm in the room. That's why we've been invited, is because it's not actually working out. But I have at IT&F been on a couple of engagements with agencies that are perfectly happy with the status quo. And in that case, we said, it's been nice working with you. We're going to end this engagement. You clearly don't need us here, don't want us here. And that's fine. I do think that this shift is best done with traumatized agencies. Like, you have to have been burned enough to say, I can't do this anymore. We have to do something differently. So it's my experience, the agencies that I work with on this approach that are effective are agencies that have figured out that the status quo is bad, but they don't have an alternative vision. Or even better, sometimes they kind of have half-formed this vision on their own. And so when I show up, everything crystallizes for them, something that they would have figured out in time anyway, but they understand, aha, there's a better way. Last point about this, the status quo persists because it's perceived as less risky. And it is, on a personal level, on a personnel level, less risky. You can blow $100 million on a big contract with IBM for a custom software project and not be fired. Because, you just did it the way everybody does it. In retrospect, maybe you would have had some stricter requirements. Let's put more requirements there next time. Like, you don't lose your job for that. But if you were going to then say, no, let's not do this. Instead of spending $100 million on IBM, let's spend $1 million on a small contract that will be the beginning of a series of modular procurements. And that's different. If that fails because you did something differently, well, that's risky. Are you actually going to get your performance bonus at the end of the year? Are you going to get that 5 rating that you wanted on your evaluation? Maybe not. So the status quo, as we see, fails at a very high rate. But if you do not have individuals within that agency who are empowered to take a different approach and who are told, hey, it's okay. If this fails, if you get a quarter of the way through $1 million project and say, this vendor's not performing, we want to cut them off, you won't be fired. It's okay. They have to have that psychological safety, because if they don't, Carl's right. Governments are not awesome at this, but it's up to folks like y'all to get government to be a lot better at this.
That resonates. Nels Frazier, I think, had a question. Go ahead, Nels.
Yeah, it's quite relevant because my first question was basically already addressed there to some extent. But the struggle I find, I come at this as a vendor, working under contracts with the government for the last 7 years, and seeing that they want to adopt this agile methodology and this kind of modularity, but they can't get over they can't get over having to have this kind of waterfall oversight.
Absolutely.
And I was just curious if you can maybe just chime in with ways that from the vendor perspective, we can help them to understand that you can't plan a 5-year contract and have it all up front in 5 weeks.
Yeah. My favorite example of this is Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS. CMS, they issue, really big grants. They're a major funder of several types of state systems, in which they'll provide up to a 90% match for some of these systems. States only have to put up 10%. So they do 2 things simultaneously. On the one hand, they say, use Agile. And on the other hand, they say, you need to give us a 5-year advanced planning document telling us on a monthly basis exactly what features you're going to deliver when. You can only do one of these things. And the requirement, which, in the agreement with CMS to get the funding, is the 5-year plan. Agile is just a strong suggestion, but you can't actually do both of those things. So we have a fundamental conflict here, and it's up to leadership to reconcile that conflict and get it fixed. To your second question, though, about what can vendors do, not much. Like I like to rail on vendors. I like to yell about vendors, but fundamentally, vendors are rational actors. Vendors are just doing what government asks for. It's up to government to stop asking for things that, I think you should saying they. I've spent so much time in federal government, but I'm out at the moment. Government stops asking for things that they shouldn't have. It's like if I just let my kids cut loose, they just have sugar for every meal. Like, no, you need fiber, kid. I don't think that there's much that vendors can do. On an interpersonal level, if you have the ear of somebody to say, like, look, here's the thing, I actually don't like working like this. Nobody likes working like this. It's a punishment to work on these stupid waterfall systems. Can you please contract differently so that we can actually do things that the users need? That could be useful. But if you respond to a bad RFP saying, hey, you're doing it wrong, I don't think that's liable to have much results. I really think it's on those of us in the government space to get this right, and on vendors to then bid on those contracts. But I don't know that vendors have much of a role in fixing this. It's not your fault.
It's really hard to be passionate about the mission from a contract perspective and know what needs to be changed, know the right way to do it, have that ear, but then hit the bureaucratic roadblocks and the risk aversion. I mean, that's the biggest thing. Everybody wants somebody else to blame. I cannot train a product owner in my agency to save my life.
Your entire problem here is very relatable. It is a normal and common problem, and I think it is substantially on secretary level positions in the federal government to say the status quo isn't working. I give you permission to take a different approach. If it's coupled with tight oversight, I give you permission to do that. So at my friend and colleague, Robin Carnahan, who's the administrator at GSA, that's what she does now for GSA, is she says, don't give me these big waterfall projects. I want demos, not memos. But these changes are a long marathon, not a sprint.
Perfect. Yeah. So I'll just say the slide that resonated, we're out of time. The slide that really resonated for me was the roles. You had red check marks, roles switching from contractor to government. I think we all could use to take that to heart a little bit. In making decisions about roles, who's going to be responsible for what on a project. And yeah, like, look, yeah, thanks for the contact information, I guess. And Cassandra, you have something?
I was going to touch on that very same slide about
Okay.
how do we fundamentally change the culture around roles in that agile control model to be more comprehensive like that. I think that's a huge resistance piece, and that would really need a lot of work to make some of this happen, in addition to perhaps having more cores to be able to handle all these contracts. But anyway,
I'm really glad to hear you say the culture change thing, because that's the problem. That's the terrible news for you. The solution to this is culture change, which is the hardest thing to change. You are absolutely right. I should have uttered that phrase at some point in the last hour. Thank you.
Right, and the comment just now that we actually have to have some staff that have that specialty is, I think, that's the thing that keeps me up at night, I guess. Is
Yep, it should.
It's a hard bit about staffing these things within government. Is the reality is we need an ownership stake. We need those people, and they're tremendously difficult to keep around on a number of levels. So with that, thank you so much. This has been fascinating. I've got a slew of notes. We've got a recording. If you'd be willing to share slides, or if you got those posted somewhere, we can link to them.
No, I made it just for this. I'll make it a PDF and send it over to you.
Okay, perfect. And I'll run things by you as we get them posted, and that's enough. Thank you much.
Thanks for having me. If I can be useful to any of y'all, really, this stuff's my idea of a good time. If anybody needs like a half-hour conversation, which I help you figure out how to implement some of this stuff, it's just, I'll do it in my spare time.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Bye, folks.
Cool. Take care.